So over the course of the last 10 years, there has been this raging debate on the left about fascism and how that concept might or might not apply to what's going on with the Trump phenomenon. And certainly related to that, now there's this broader question of how dangerously authoritarian the Trump 2.0 administration has been. And I want to kind of get into both of those topics over the course of this and also try to tie it together. So in other words, I want to get into the question of Trump-style authoritarianism, what, if anything, the difference is between that and fascism, and maybe most importantly, why anybody should care, right? Is this just a debate about semantics? Does it actually matter in any way? So the Global Labor University is a degree program for labor scholars. It's based in Germany, but a lot of trade unionists from different countries around the world end up going to it. And after I wrote this article last year during the election for the Global Labor column, which is affiliated, the Global Labor University people invited me to give a lecture on the rise of authoritarianism in uncertain times for GLU alumni. And if you want to read the whole thing, it was reprinted at Everyday Analysis under the title Trump, not fascist, but dangerously authoritarian. I think we have that graphic also. And I think the reason they invited me was because of a couple of things that I'd written, about these topics during, one of them was during the election, and the other was kind of just after the election last year. And what I said in the GLU talk obviously overlaps a lot with what I wrote in those two places, but it's also different because obviously I've kept thinking about it as the facts on the ground have changed and the kind of degree of authoritarianism from the Trump administration keeps on metastasizing in genuinely wild ways. As I hope is obvious as I kind of go through this, I mean, this is stuff I'm not claiming to have all the answers about. I'm very much still trying to figure it all out. Especially because, what I'm going to say here is going to be mostly taken from that GLU talk. I don't have time to say everything that I said there. Again, go check out the whole transcript at Everyday Analysis if you want to get the whole thing. And also, I'm trying to incorporate some of what's gone on since that talk, since honestly, some of the worst horrors of Trump 2.0 have actually gone down since late February, not that long ago, which is when I gave the original talk, right? Mahmoud Khalil hadn't happened. Trump ignoring court orders to turn back, planes of deportees he'd accused without any sort of judicial process of being gang members, at least one of whom we know pretty much 100% for sure is not, to life in prison, nightmarish prison in a third country. That hadn't happened yet, but a lot had. And I think it's maybe good to take a deep breath here and think about not just what's gone on in the last couple months, but what's gone on in the last 10 years since Trump came down that escalator to announce his first candidacy with a demented speech about Mexican rapists. To be honest, some part of me still has a hard time believing or understanding the extent to which American politics has realigned itself around the personality of this strange, spiteful, childlike person who was, it's sometimes hard to remember, a reality television host before he was ever a politician, but here we are. And in that last decade, a lot of the debate about Trump on the left, and particularly on the intellectual left, has been about whether he counts as a fascist. So I want to start by saying a few things about the substance of that debate before we get to kind of the broader issues and again, what, if anything, the political stakes are of all this. Whenever you see anybody claiming that example X is an instance of broader phenomenon Y, a pretty obvious place to start the discussion is by asking what people mean by Y, right? So we can then see if X actually fits the definition that they have in mind. And when it comes to fascism, even very smart people often struggle when asked to define the term. I often hear phrases like ultra-nationalism, for example, but I rarely see much clarity on what's supposed to make some nationalisms but not others ultra. In World War I, for example, when anti-German hysteria in the United States reached such a fever pitch that German books were systematically removed from libraries, was that an example of regular American nationalism or this special ultra-nationalism? How about World War II, when we went so far as to round up American citizens of Japanese descent and put them in internment camps for the duration of the war? Are European soccer hooligans who go around randomly assaulting people on the street for being suspected fans of the opposing national team ultra-nationalists, even if when they go home, the hooligans vote for mainstream parties or don't vote instead of voting for parties of the far right? These are all examples of nationalism making people extremely cruel and stupid, certainly, but that's what nationalism does. Analysts who focus on rhetorical similarities between Trumpism and classical European fascism like to throw around phrases like nostalgia for an imagined past and visions of national greatness. And it's true enough that these were central rhetorical tropes of the followers of Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco. But these have also been rhetorical staples of any number of conservative and reactionary movements, both long before and long after classical European fascism. See, for example, Ronald Reagan's campaigns for president in 1980 and 1984, which were, by the way, the source from which Donald Trump and Steve Bannon lifted that phrase, "Make America Great Again," for Trump's first campaign in 2016. It seems to me that all we really learn from the fact that various kinds of right-wingers, including but not limited to fascists, go to these same rhetorical wells is just kind of the uninterestingly obvious fact that fascism is a phenomenon of the right. Classical Marxist analyses of fascism focused not on how fascists talked, but on what they did. In his brilliant writings on the rise of fascism in Germany, for example, Leon Trotsky emphasized that the unique feature of fascism, as opposed to other kinds of right-wing authoritarianisms, is that fascism starts as a grassroots mass movement that battles socialists and communists and busts up labor unions and bloody street fighting. When fascist movements achieve state power, they overthrow parliamentary democracy, ban unions and opposition parties, and supplement or even partially replace the traditional repressive machinery of the state with their own forces. Think brown shirts, black shirts, etc. Nothing like that has come remotely close to happening in the Trump era in the United States. Right-wing paramilitary groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are microscopically tiny. They're beset with federal informants, and they have no capacity whatsoever to physically terrorize their enemies. Compared to serious right-wing paramilitaries in a country like Brazil, groups that control territory like drug gangs and sometimes assassinate left-wing politicians like Marielle Franco, armed rightist groups in the United States feel more like live-action role players. I certainly agree that Trump deserves moral condemnation for his coddling of these elements, for example, through his sweeping pardon of even violent Jan 6 defendants. But honestly, these people are such minor players, you could pretty much tell the story of Trumpism without them. And going back to the Brazil analogy, even when Bolsonaro was president, it didn't seem to me that fascism had actually been imposed in Brazil, even if the raw materials for it were far more developed than they'd been in the United States. Bolsonaro, after all, was deposed not by some equivalent of the Red Army marching on Berlin or Italian partisans hanging Mussolini, but because a free press exposed his wrongdoing. He lost a democratic election, and an independent judiciary held him accountable once he was out of office. On the other side of the divide between Trotskyists and Stalinists, the Comintern's main theorist of fascism was Georgy Dimitrov, who defined fascism as the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, most imperialist elements of finance capital. While Trotsky's definition has been a bigger influence on my own thinking about fascism over the years, you might prefer Dimitrov's definition, if only because it casts a wider net by emphasizing what fascists do with state power rather than how they achieved it in the first place, like Trotsky does. Pinochet's Chile, for example, probably wouldn't count in the Trotsky definition, but it might well count according to Dimitrov, and perhaps it should. Certainly, if what we were facing under Trump was anything like what happened under Pinochet, the academic debate about whether it counted as fascism would be completely beside the point. Whatever you make of that issue, though, Trump is certainly very far from fulfilling Dimitrov's description, at least when you remember what sort of example he had in mind when he formulated it, right? Where his spectrum of most ended in Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, etc. Whatever Trump's very real and disturbing authoritarian tendencies or his acts of extreme performative cruelty toward migrants and refugees, he's just not going to ban the Democratic Party and start filling concentration camps with dissidents. Something Trotsky emphasizes, and I don't think Dimitrov would disagree, is that capital only tends to throw its weight behind actual full-on fascism when its back is up against the wall. Honestly, empowering a Hitler or a Mussolini is pretty destabilizing. There's a reason parliamentary democracy is the state form which advanced and reasonably prosperous capitalist societies tend to gravitate to over time. I'm not saying that capitalists have ever just given people democratic rights without people at the bottom of society having to fight for them. But ultimately, once the system is in place, capitalists do tend to know better than to rock the boat too much on the democratic basics. If you want to manage popular frustrations without too much instability while the underlying, profit accumulating machine whirs along extracting surplus value from the working class, you're better off with the degree of long-term popular legitimacy multi-party democracies can achieve. Capital only tends to sacrifice that stability when the capitalists have a real and credible fear that the alternative is that they'll lose everything in a socialist revolution. In the United States, our rate of private sector unionization is 6%? We've never had a mass electorally viable social democratic party, never mind some revolutionary communist cadre capable of making a bid for state power. We haven't had any citywide general strikes since the 1930s, and we've never had even one single national general strike in this country. Even the social democratic wing of the Democratic Party was handily crushed by the Democratic establishment in the 2020 primaries. And, the oligarchy tour is great. I love it, right? You love to see it. But, it certainly hasn't staged anything like the kind of comeback that could actually take it into power. And at this point in the conversation, right, once you kind of admit that the sort of circumstances that gave rise to fascism have nothing in common with the background circumstances in the United States, people will often say, oh, you're assuming that 21st century American fascism will play out like 20th century European fascism. But no, it's going to be its own thing with its own characteristics. But if you want to talk that way, the next step has to be for you to provide a clear, operational, useful definition of your own. And to be honest, at least in my experience, that next step never quite seems to happen. When you get right down to it, the reason people desperately want to claim the F word is that World War II is the last big moral touchstone that everyone more or less in our society agrees on. Elon Musk is the kind of deeply grotesque human being who thinks that it's funny to do a Hitler salute and give a jokey little explanation of why he did it. Oh, see, I was throwing the crowd my heart. But even Elon Musk made a pilgrimage to Auschwitz, since that kind of thing is one of the most unifying political rituals of the ruling class. Vladimir Putin's stated justification for invading Ukraine was that he wanted to denazify that country, given the presence of far-right forces like the Azov Battalion. And on the other side, we've had 3 years of anyone who criticizes U.S. policy in Ukraine or calls for de-escalation, peace negotiations, being compared to Chamberlain at Munich. Everyone wants to take the mantle of World War II, in other words. 80 years after the camps were liberated by the Red Army, Hitler's regime remains our most potent symbol of evil. And when I say our, I really do mean damn near everyone. Right? After Bannon imitated Elon's trollish Sieg Heil, even Marine Le Pen felt the need to distance herself because those are just the rules. The Nazis are still the most easily hateable mainstream movie bad guys. That's half of why leftists want the emotional satisfaction of calling our enemies fascists. The other half is that just like World War II was the heroic period for the United States military, for example, the struggle against fascism that culminated in that war was the heroic period of the left. We, or rather our much older comrades, were the ones who did things like fight in Spain with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and got labeled as premature anti-fascists in later FBI files. It's right and proper that people take pride in that history. And honestly, I have no objection to anyone who just wants to use the word fascist as an insult, applying it to Trump and Musk and the rest. God knows few people in the world more richly deserve to be insulted. And if it's cathartic to you to throw it around that way, go for it. Don't let me stop you. But my reason for pushing back so hard against the attempts of some left-wing intellectuals to say, no, it's not just an expressive political swear word. We're literally fighting fascism, is that I think it's a misleading theory of what we're up against. Like pretty much everyone to the left of, I don't know, Ted Cruz, I've been horrified by a lot of what's gone on in the last 2 months. But trying to analytically force this into the mold of the enemies we faced in our heroic period risks making us miss what's actually novel, right? The title of the original Global Labor University talk was The Rise of Authoritarian Regimes in Uncertain Times. And that strikes me as exactly right. I really want to tarry on the fact that these are uncertain times. The fact that these are uncharted territories and genuinely no one has any idea where this is going. I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence by claiming to have a complete and well-formed theory of the phenomenon, let alone what we can do about it. I don't. But I want to at least urge people to think about it in a more clear-eyed way. Let's at least start there. Something my friend and occasional co-author Danny Bessner emphasizes in his work on this, and I think it really is worth emphasizing, is that these rising right-wing authoritarian movements around the world are a symptom of the deep failures of standard liberal governance. Consensus politics has been running on fumes for a very long time, dining out on accomplishments like defeating fascism and instituting modern welfare states that happened before the vast majority of people alive now were even born. And in any case, at least some of these accomplishments have been deeply hollowed out by half a century of neoliberal retreat. In the United States, the secondary domestic heroic period of liberalism was the civil rights movement. And there are at least rough equivalents in some other countries around the world. So a lot of mainstream liberalism's attempts here and elsewhere to create the impression of a sort of moral purpose to justify itself have involved things like increasing gender equality and acceptance of sexual minorities, increasing racial diversity. And of course, I think all of these things are welcome forms of social progress. I take it for granted that, 99% of the people watching think all of that, right? Why be a socialist if you didn't have a basic normative commitment to human equality? But progress in these domains are sometimes really hollow pseudo progress, or quite often a messy combination of genuine progress and performative nonsense, has played out in the shadow of economic neoliberalism. The original civil rights movement in the United States wanted to follow up the destruction of Jim Crow with egalitarian economic initiatives. Remember, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was delivered at the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. But even in the mid-1960s, American capital wasn't going to accept massive jobs programs that would cripple its bargaining power against the working class. And by the late 1970s, under Jimmy Carter, even the Democratic Party had started its big neoliberal turn. And in different ways and to different degrees, and certainly on different timelines, broadly similar things have happened in many other countries throughout the world. The effect of all these trends is to give us a kind of liberalism that focuses on diversifying the ruling class and shaking its finger at, uncouth proles who, don't know all of the, correct progressive niceties, maybe making them sit through a lot of diversity trainings, even at the same time they worry that they'll lose their jobs to cutbacks. And the entirely predictable effect of all that is to create a lot of room for reactionary monsters who can now portray themselves as this edgy countercultural force, as a kind of collective middle finger to the oh-so-benevolent and enlightened liberal technocrats. It's a petri dish in which new and more virulently authoritarian strains of right-wing politics can grow. And in the GLU talk, this is the point where I went into a bunch of different examples around the world of right-wing authoritarianism in other countries, cases like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Netanyahu in Israel and Marine Le Pen in France, and how they were similar to or different from Trump. But I'll just skip all that for now and go to the United States because I want to make a few related points about all of this. One of the things that I found the most persistently frustrating about the left's fascism debate in the last decade is that it's often felt polarized between, on the one hand, the position that Trump is literally Adolf Hitler, and on the other hand, the position that he wasn't even worse than Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. Those positions feel equally absurd to me. The single American left-wing intellectual I most deeply admire, Adolph Reed, wrote an essay in 2016 encouraging people in swing states to vote for Hillary Clinton. It was called Vote for the Lying Neoliberal Warmonger. It's important. I think he was correct. And I have, much to the frustration of some of my comrades, I've been publicly advocating the same position during the last two election cycles. Maybe I'm just a simplistic person, but given the choice between a lesser evil and a greater evil, my position is that diminishing the amount of evil is better for the workers' movement and for humanity in general. I've never believed we would be able to meaningfully influence corporate Democrats like Biden or Harris to move to the left. Sadly, I don't think we have the capacity for that, but I do think that we're better off not having what little organizational capacity has been built up by the American working class, subject to an all-out assault on all fronts, which is exactly what we've seen. Trump, as I've talked about several times on this show, is making a real credible attempt to actually outright abolish the National Labor Relations Board that protects basic unionization rights, or at least strip it of so much of its enforcement power that the NLRB might as well be gone. And on core issues of constitutional governance and core liberal rights, we're facing the kind of lurches in the wrong direction that we haven't witnessed in this country in a very long time. The degree of assertion of executive power at the expense of the legislative branch that we've been seeing, that kind of basic assault on small R Republican principles, has reached a point where I think that we may need to relearn Marxist vocabulary from a lot longer ago than the 1930s, right? Words like Bonapartism. And while I don't expect Trump to declare himself president for life or anything like that, I certainly think that there will be an election in 2028. But pretty clearly, after the defunding of Colombia, after the disappearance of green card holder Mahmoud Khalil, quite openly and undisguisedly as a punishment for his engaging in constitutionally protected political protest, free speech rights in this country are in much worse trouble than we've seen in a very long time. And Trump's latest assault on the right of criminal defendants, with these deportations without process to El Salvador of alleged Venezuelan gang members, really rivals what Bush was doing in the darkest period of the post 9/11 war on terror. And, look, on the one hand, I think that the differences between this and fascism are very obvious, right? I mean, when a Mussolini or Hitler took over their country, they were consolidating their control over the United States, and there's a sense in which you could say that about Trump and Musk. But of course, when you zoom into the details, one was building out state capacity, and the other is closer to stripping it for its copper wiring while everything falls apart like some sort of bizarre self-inflicted version of post-Soviet shock therapy. But yeah, the authoritarianism, the assault on free speech, the assault on the right of criminal defendants, these things are all very real and very, very disturbing. But I think if we're going to think seriously about the particular horrors we're facing, it's a good idea to expand our repertoire of historical analogies. Not because whatever happens is going to be simply a reenactment of anything that's already happened, right? Trump is no more the reincarnation of Woodrow Wilson than he is the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. He's something new, right? But because remembering the sheer variety of horrible things that have happened at various points in our history can help us orient ourselves as we think about ways to fight the more recent grotesqueries emerging not only in this country, but all around the world as the socially progressive strain of neoliberalism loses its grip on any kind of popular legitimacy. So let's talk seriously about that. The first Red Scare happened under Woodrow Wilson, the same president who did what Trump has threatened to do and militarily intervened in Mexico. Tons of socialist and communist immigrants were rounded up and deported from the country under the Wilson administration. Eugene V. Debs went to jail under Wilson for giving a fiery speech condemning World War I and calling on the American working class to refuse to participate. Wilson also gave encouragement to the Ku Klux Klan back when that was a far more deadly right-wing paramilitary force than anything that we face right now. Another historical analogy I've suggested in some of what I've written about this, the article for Damage Magazine, where, after the election, that, I'd also brought up the Wilson analogy that was in the title. But another analogy that I also brought up in that same article was the beginning of the Cold War under Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Both were very far from being Nazis. Truman was the president who oversaw the final defeat of the Nazis in his first month in office, and Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander who carried it out. But they instituted much worse forms of repression in many ways than anything that, at least as of this second, it looks like we'll be facing. Again, I really meant what I said about uncertain times. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not going to lie to you guys and say I know exactly how bad things could get. Nobody knows exactly how bad things could get. But at least in terms of a snapshot of anything anybody is talking about right now, it's nothing like as bad as the Eisenhower era, the era of loyalty oaths and blacklists and something called the Communist Control Act of 1954 that formally banned the Communist Party USA. And I don't bring any of this up to say, oh, Trump isn't so bad, or, Nigel, if Nigel Farage becomes prime minister of the United Kingdom, that won't be a big deal, or, Marine Le Pen won't be that bad if she takes charge of France. In all honesty, all of it is pretty horrifying. And when and where this makes sense tactically, sorry, guys, I absolutely think that the serious working class left should be willing to make short-term alliances with liberals we hate to stop it from happening, even as we recognize that this stuff is a symptom and the decomposition of liberalism is the disease, and we need to create an alternative to the liberals to have any hope of solving the problem in the long run. Rather, I think pointing to forebears for what we're facing now that are less apocalyptic than classical European fascism can precisely help us to be better fighters against all of this stuff. If real literal fascists on the 1930s model are about to take over your country, or they've already done so, you basically have a couple of options. The first is that you flee the country, and don't tell me you can't afford to, because in situations like this, huge numbers of people will flee with nothing but the clothes on their back and walk hundreds of miles on foot like Syrians did when they were fleeing Assad. The second is that you stay, but you go underground, carefully hiding your politics so you can carry on resistance activities. Even under a fascist regime, those are both decisions that small groups or even individuals can make all on their own. The third, which only works if a massive proportion of your society is willing to take this leap with you, is that you take up arms like the Spanish Republic, which would, of course, involve killing massive numbers of your fellow citizens and seeing a massive number of people on your own side get killed. Then if you lose, you can maybe go into hiding and do the second option, but probably you're really looking at the first option. And if you return, it's going to be after a revolution like Portugal in the 70s, or following the liberation of the country by invading armies like the end of World War II. But that's not how the left responded to Wilson or Eisenhower. I'm not saying no one left, or that there might not even now be people who make a rational decision that leaving is the best option for them. There totally could be. But by and large, that's not what we did in response to those earlier bouts of authoritarian repression. We stayed, we marched and wrote and spoke and organized in defense of civil liberties. We challenged them in the courts. We stuck up for workers' rights in the workplace, and we weathered the storm. We stayed and we lived to fight another day, and that is exactly what we need to do now. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.